The train's wheels screeched as it finally came to a halt on the outskirts of Camp Alona, a small, remote military base nestled in the plains of Arkansas. The gray sky hung heavy above, mirroring the somber mood inside the train. The men inside, all Japanese prisoners of war, had been transported across the Pacific under guard, their minds filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. They had heard whispers of American brutality, of inhumane conditions, and the unrelenting cruelty that awaited them upon arrival. But nothing could have prepared them for the strange reality they were about to face. The train doors creaked open, and one by one, the prisoners disembarked onto foreign soil. Their faces were pale, weathered from weeks of travel, and their bodies stiff from confinement. As they stepped off the train, their eyes scanned the surroundings, half expecting to be met with a brutal reception. Yet, instead of the harsh sounds of military discipline, they were greeted by something entirely unexpected. The quiet hum of the camp, the distant chatter of soldiers, and a clean, orderly environment that seemed too peaceful to be true. The prisoners were processed one by one, their names and identification details carefully recorded. At first, the men remained silent, too stunned to speak. They had been taught to expect harsh interrogations and immediate punishment, but instead, they were being treated with an unfamiliar level of dignity. The medical checks were swift but thorough, conducted by American doctors who seemed more focused on ensuring the men's well-being than on extracting information. The whole experience felt surreal, as if they had stepped into a different world where the rules of war were being rewritten before their eyes. As the prisoners were led to their quarters, their confusion grew. The barracks were modest but clean, each one furnished with simple cots, blankets, and basic amenities. It was nothing luxurious, but it was worlds apart from the squalid conditions they had endured in their previous captivity. The floors were swept, the windows were intact, and the air smelled of fresh linens, not the staleness they had grown accustomed to in their previous camps. The Japanese men exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to feel relieved or suspicious of this strange kindness. That evening, as the prisoners were gathered in the mess hall for their first meal in the camp, the sense of confusion deepened. The sight before them was unlike anything they had imagined. The tables were neatly arranged, and the food was served on clean metal plates. The smell that filled the room was unfamiliar to them, a combination of cooked meat, vegetables, and something sweet that hung in the air. It was the kind of smell that would have made their mouths water had they not been so distracted by the strangeness of their surroundings. The food was served in large portions, far more than any of the prisoners had expected. The bread was white and soft, unlike the coarse brown loaves they had been eating in their own camps. And then there were the hot dogs sizzling in their buns, something none of the prisoners had ever seen before. The men stared at the food, unsure of how to react. It didn't resemble anything they had eaten in Japan, and they had been taught to expect the worst from their captors. The idea of eating such a meal felt almost like an insult, but as their stomachs growled with hunger, the reality set in. They had no choice but to eat. For a few moments, the room was silent as the Japanese prisoners hesitated, unsure whether to accept what was offered. Finally, one of the older prisoners, a man named Kaito, broke the silence by cautiously picking up a piece of the bread. He held it in his hands, examining it as if it were an alien artifact. The others watched him, waiting for his reaction. Slowly, he took a bite. His eyes widened with surprise as the softness of the bread and the unfamiliar flavors flooded his senses. It wasn't what he had expected at all, but it was filling. Still, there was a lingering sense of disbelief among the prisoners. This bread, this food, felt wrong in so many ways. It didn't match the image they had of their captors, nor did it fit the narrative they had been told about America. The hot dogs were even stranger, and several men couldn't bring themselves to try them. It was too foreign, too different from anything they had known. Yet, as the meal progressed, a few of the men began to eat with greater ease, as if the hunger had finally overcome their skepticism. But the unease didn't disappear. The strange food, the unexpected treatment, and the surreal quiet of the camp continued to unsettle them. As the men ate, they exchanged looks, wondering what this all meant. Were the Americans truly treating them as human beings, or was this some form of psychological manipulation? The thought that they might be treated with kindness felt foreign and unsettling, but deep down they couldn't deny the relief that came with it. It was the beginning of an unsettling new chapter in their lives, one where nothing was quite as it seemed. The days following the arrival of the Japanese prisoners at Camp Alona were filled with a strange mixture of confusion and disbelief. For the men, each day was a battle between the reality they had been told to expect and the unexpected kindness they were now encountering. In their minds, they had been taught to prepare for the worst: cruel interrogations, forced labor, and unimaginable treatment. But instead, they found themselves treated with a level of care and respect that was almost impossible to comprehend. The food, especially, was a constant source of discomfort. The white bread and hot dogs, so foreign to their senses, had become a symbol of the vast cultural divide between them and their captors. They had grown up on rice and fish, simple foods that connected them to their heritage and their families. Now they were confronted with a meal that felt like an insult. The bread was soft, almost sweet, and the hot dogs, strangely processed and plump, seemed like nothing more than a strange imitation of what they knew as food. Despite the unfamiliarity, the men were hungry, and as the days passed, they began to reluctantly accept the meals they were given. But even as they ate, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong. The food didn't match the image they had of their captors. They had been prepared for starvation and hardship, not the relative luxury of the mess hall. It was as if the Americans were offering them something they didn't deserve, something that felt too good to be true. And so, they ate with mixed feelings, their stomachs grateful, but their minds filled with doubt. The American soldiers, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease with the situation. They moved through the camp with casual authority, greeting the prisoners with the same polite detachment they reserved for their fellow soldiers. The guards were professional, but they didn't carry the same air of menace the men had expected. Some even attempted to engage the prisoners in small talk, asking questions about their families or their hometowns, as if there was no barrier between them. The prisoners, still on edge, didn't know how to respond. They had been trained to hate their enemies, to view them as less than human. But here they were, being treated with a level of decency they had never imagined. The oddest part of all was the American officers, who, while maintaining a strict sense of order, didn't seem to view the prisoners with the same level of animosity they had expected. Instead, they appeared almost embarrassed by the whole situation. Lieutenant Thompson, the camp's senior officer, would often be seen walking through the camp with a furrowed brow, seemingly lost in thought. He had a look of someone caught between duty and moral conflict, unsure how to treat the men who, just months ago, had been their enemies. His demeanor was kind, but there was an underlying discomfort, as if he were grappling with the contradictions of the situation. The more the Japanese prisoners observed the American soldiers, the more confused they became. It was as if the rules of war had been turned on their heads. There was no hatred in the eyes of the Americans, no cruelty in their actions. Even the guards, who were supposed to be their captors, seemed almost apologetic. This was not the behavior of the brutal conquerors they had been led to believe they would face. And yet, the prisoners couldn't fully embrace the idea that they were being treated well. The years of indoctrination and the harsh realities of war had instilled in them a deep mistrust of their enemies, and it was hard to shake off the idea that something was amiss. One of the older prisoners, Mr. Yamamoto, spent his nights reflecting on the strangeness of their situation. He was an intelligent man, a former teacher in Japan, and he had always believed that honor and dignity were the guiding principles of any conflict. But here, in this strange American camp, he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the concept of honor might not apply in the way he had always thought. The Americans were treating them with a level of humanity that didn't fit the narrative of war he had been taught. It made him uneasy, as if the very foundation of his beliefs was crumbling before his eyes. As the days turned into weeks, the Japanese prisoners began to feel an unsettling sense of guilt. They had come to the camp expecting to be treated as lesser beings, expecting cruelty and hardship. Instead, they found themselves in a situation where they were being cared for in ways they had never imagined. The bread, once a symbol of foreignness and mockery, began to take on new meaning. It wasn't just food, it was a gesture of kindness, an offering of peace. But for the men, it was still difficult to accept. They had been taught to view their enemies with suspicion, and the reality of their situation was forcing them to reevaluate everything they had been led to believe. The more they tried to understand their captors, the more confused they became. The Americans, who had once been the enemy, were now acting as though they were equals. The prisoners, who had once been proud soldiers of the Japanese Empire, were now finding themselves in a position where they had to accept help, food, and kindness from those they had been taught to despise. It was a reversal of roles, and it left them feeling exposed and vulnerable. The sense of pride they had carried with them into the camp began to wane, replaced by a creeping sense of humility that they couldn't quite shake off. In the mess hall, the laughter and camaraderie that the Americans shared seemed so foreign to the prisoners. The soldiers spoke easily to one another, sharing jokes and stories from their homes, as if they had no enemies to fight. The prisoners sat in silence, watching them, unsure of how to respond. They were soldiers too, but now they were prisoners, and the divide between them and their captors seemed wider than ever. They had been taught that war was about victory and dominance, but here, in this strange camp, they were learning that it was also about something else, something that didn't quite fit into the narrative they had been given. As the days went by, the tension among the Japanese prisoners began to grow. Despite their growing discomfort with the situation, the strangeness of their treatment by the Americans weighed heavily on their minds. They had been trained to expect harsh conditions and constant cruelty, but what they found was a stark contrast to their expectations. The American soldiers, while not overly friendly, were polite and often courteous, which only seemed to increase the prisoners' confusion. The food they had been given, bread and hot dogs, had seemed like an insult at first, but now, with each passing day, the prisoners couldn't avoid the fact that their situation was, in many ways, more bearable than they had imagined. Yet, despite the comforts they found, the tension among the prisoners was palpable. The younger soldiers particularly felt conflicted. They had been raised to believe that the Americans were their enemies, the ones who had to be defeated at all costs. Now, they found themselves in a camp where their enemies were treating them not as subjugated prisoners, but as people. It felt like a betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe about the war. They began to question their own pride, their own identity, and their place in this new reality. It was during one of the meals in the mess hall that the first real incident occurred. The Japanese prisoners had been given their usual portions of white bread and hot dogs, but this time there was something different in the air. Some of the prisoners, particularly the older men, were beginning to talk among themselves, their voices hushed but urgent. The bread, which they had reluctantly accepted in the past, was now a point of contention. Some of the men felt that it was beneath their dignity to eat something so foreign and so unappetizing. Others argued that it was just food and that they should accept it, as it was the only thing keeping them from going hungry. The argument escalated when one of the younger soldiers, a man named Ichiro, stood up from the table and slammed his fist onto the wooden surface. He pointed at the bread, his face flushed with anger. "This is not food," he shouted. "This is an insult to our heritage. We are warriors, not beggars." His voice echoed through the mess hall, drawing the attention of both the prisoners and the American guards. The other prisoners fell silent, looking at Ichiro with a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. It was clear that he was not only angry at the bread, but at the entire situation they had found themselves in. The American guards, who had been going about their duties as usual, froze at the outburst. Sergeant Thompson, the officer in charge of the camp, was nearby and quickly approached the table. He held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Ichiro, still seething with anger, turned to face the sergeant. "You Americans mock us," he spat. "You feed us this garbage, as if we are nothing but animals. You think you can break us with food?" His words were sharp, and the room seemed to hold its breath as the tension grew. Sergeant Thompson stood for a moment, taking in the situation. He had seen his fair share of confrontations in his time in the military, but this felt different. There was no hate in Ichiro's eyes, just a deep sense of frustration and confusion. The sergeant exhaled slowly, trying to find the right words. "This is just food," he said, his tone measured. "It's not meant to mock you. It's what we eat here. We're not trying to insult you." The words, though calm, did little to soothe Ichiro's anger. He crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing. "Then why are we here?" he demanded. "Why are we in your camp? Why are we treated like this, as if we are nothing?" The other prisoners watched in silence, unsure of how to react. Some of them felt a sense of shame at Ichiro's outburst, while others silently agreed with his frustration. They had been prisoners for months, some even longer, and the idea of being treated like equals by their captors was something they could not yet grasp. They had been raised on a strict code of honor, a code that told them that weakness was to be avoided at all costs. But here, in this American camp, they were faced with a new reality, one in which they were forced to rely on their enemies for survival. The confrontation with Sergeant Thompson had a profound effect on the camp. The American soldiers, who had been following their orders with professional detachment, began to notice the growing resentment among the prisoners. The guards, who had once been polite and even cordial, began to maintain a stricter distance, as if they were unsure of how to handle the situation. The atmosphere in the camp, once filled with uneasy calm, now felt charged with a palpable sense of distrust. Meanwhile, Ichiro's outburst had a ripple effect among the prisoners. Some began to question their treatment, wondering if they were being manipulated in some way. Others, however, were beginning to accept the reality of their situation. They had been given food, they had been given shelter, and they had been treated with an unexpected degree of humanity. But the emotional toll of being prisoners in a foreign land, surrounded by soldiers they had once considered their enemies, was taking its toll. As the days wore on, Ichiro became more withdrawn, and his anger seemed to simmer beneath the surface. He would eat his meals in silence, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something he could not find. The other prisoners, though still uncomfortable with the idea of being treated with kindness, began to accept the reality that this was their life now. They were prisoners, yes, but they were alive, and they were being cared for in ways they had never imagined. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one they slowly began to come to terms with. The clash in the mess hall marked a turning point for the prisoners. It was the first real expression of resistance to the kindness they were receiving, and it left everyone involved feeling uneasy. The Americans, unsure of how to react to such a display, took a step back. The Japanese prisoners, meanwhile, were left to grapple with the idea that their enemies were treating them with a respect they had never imagined. It was a strange, uncomfortable feeling, one that would take time to fully understand. But in that moment, it was clear that the divide between captor and captive was not as wide as it once seemed. As the days passed, a subtle shift began to take place in the camp. While the Japanese prisoners remained conflicted about their treatment, there was an undeniable sense of weariness that settled over them. The confusion and frustration from their initial arrival had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet resignation that they were, in some strange way, being cared for. The food, once met with mockery and disdain, was now seen as a necessary part of their survival. But the discomfort lingered, like an unspoken tension that no one could completely shake. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, a young prisoner, Laiko, became ill. She had been feeling unwell for a few days, but it wasn't until she collapsed during roll call that anyone truly realized how serious her condition was. The camp doctor was called immediately, his face a mixture of concern and professional detachment as he examined her. The diagnosis was clear. Laiko had contracted a fever, likely from the exhaustion of the journey and the stress of being confined in the camp. But the real challenge was how to treat her, especially in a place so far from home. Sam Washington, the camp's cook, was working in the kitchen when he heard about Laiko's illness. He had already begun preparing the evening meal, but when he learned of her condition, he knew he had to do something more. He had grown up in the South, where food had always been considered more than just sustenance. It was a way to show care, to comfort those in need. He remembered his grandmother's remedy for children with fevers: warm milk-soaked cornbread with honey. It was a simple dish, but it had always worked wonders for him and his family. He decided to make it for Laiko, hoping it might bring some relief. As Sam moved through the kitchen, his hands moving with practiced ease, he couldn't help but think about the prisoners and their strange reaction to his food. The cornbread he had served them had been met with laughter and mockery, but now he hoped it could serve a higher purpose. He carefully prepared the dish, making sure the cornbread was soft and golden, the milk warm and comforting. He added just enough honey to sweeten it, but not so much that it would overpower the other flavors. Once it was ready, he brought it to the infirmary himself, unsure of how the Japanese prisoners would respond to the dish this time. When Sam arrived at Laiko's bedside, she was lying on a cot, her face flushed with fever. Her eyes fluttered open as he entered, and she looked at him with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. Sam sat down beside her, his heart heavy with concern for the young woman. He had seen many sick people in his time, but there was something about Laiko's fragile state that struck him deeply. She was so far from home, from everything she knew, and now she was sick in an American prison camp. It wasn't fair. "Laiko," Sam said softly, his voice steady but kind, "I brought you something. My grandmother always said this could help when a child had a fever." He spooned a small portion of the cornbread soaked in warm milk and held it out to her, his hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. Laiko stared at the spoon for a moment, her eyes glazed with fever, and then she looked up at Sam, as if unsure whether to trust him. But something in his expression, something in his gentle manner, made her decide to take the bite. The warm cornbread slid down her throat, and for the first time since her illness began, she felt a small measure of comfort. The honey sweetness, the soft texture of the cornbread, and the warmth of the milk worked together to calm her racing thoughts. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the taste, and then opened them again, meeting Sam's gaze. "It's good," she whispered, the words heavy with gratitude. "Thank you." Sam smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. For a moment, the divide between them seemed to vanish. Here, in this small act of kindness, there were no barriers of nationality, no lines between captor and captive. There was just one human being offering another comfort in their time of need. The simplicity of the moment struck Sam deeply, and he realized that sometimes food could be more than just a meal. It could be a bridge, a way to reach across the gap between two very different worlds. As Laiko ate the cornbread, Sam watched her with quiet care. Her fever still raged, But the small smile on her face, the way she seemed to relax into the warmth of the food, gave him hope. He had no idea if the cornbread would cure her illness, but for the first time since her arrival, it seemed like she was at peace. And in that moment, Sam knew that, despite all the differences between them, this simple act of kindness had made a difference. It had been a small, unspoken acknowledgement of their shared humanity, and in that moment, it was enough. Back in the barracks, the other Japanese prisoners began to hear about the meal Sam had prepared for Laiko. It was a small thing, a simple dish, but it carried with it a message that they had not expected. The Americans, who they had been taught to fear and despise, were offering them something more than just food. They were offering compassion. It was a hard thing to accept, especially for the older prisoners, who had lived through years of war and loss. But as the days passed, the memory of Sam's act began to shift something inside them. Perhaps, they thought, there was more to this camp than they had first believed. The healing meal that Sam had prepared for Laiko marked the beginning of a subtle change in the camp. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was a shift nonetheless. The Japanese prisoners began to realize that the food, once a symbol of foreignness and mockery, had become something more. It had become a symbol of care, of hope, and perhaps even of the possibility for understanding between two very different cultures. For Laiko, the cornbread was more than just a meal. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, small acts of kindness could make all the difference. As the weeks passed, the camp began to take on a routine. The American guards continued to patrol the grounds with a professional, detached air, while the Japanese prisoners settled into their new existence. The initial shock and confusion had given way to a quieter acceptance of their circumstances. While there were still moments of tension and mistrust, particularly among the younger prisoners, a sense of normalcy began to emerge. The food, once met with mockery and confusion, had become a regular part of their lives, and the prisoners started to adapt to the strange new reality they found themselves in. Yet, despite these outward signs of adjustment, the emotional distance between the captives and their captors remained a persistent undercurrent. It was during one of the afternoon roll calls that the first signs of change began to appear. Sergeant Thompson, who had been one of the more approachable figures in the camp, made an unexpected announcement. He informed the prisoners that they would now be allowed to participate in recreational activities, including card games with the guards. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some of the prisoners, especially the older ones, remained suspicious. They had been trained to distrust their enemies, and the idea of playing games with their captors seemed like a trick, a way to break their spirits by distracting them from the reality of their captivity. But others, more open to the possibility of easing the tension, saw it as an opportunity to break down some of the barriers between them and the Americans. The first game night was awkward, to say the least. The Japanese prisoners had little experience with Western games, especially poker, and the guards were equally unsure of how to engage with them. The atmosphere was stiff, filled with hesitant glances and strained smiles. But as the evening wore on, something remarkable began to happen. The tension, which had been thick in the air from the very beginning, slowly began to dissipate. The guards, who had been trained to see the prisoners as less than human, started to see them as individuals, not as enemies. The prisoners, for their part, began to realize that the guards were not all that different from them. They, too, were just soldiers, doing their duty, following orders, and trying to survive the war. Greta, the unofficial leader of the Japanese prisoners, watched the scene unfold from a quiet corner of the room. She had initially been skeptical of the idea of interacting with the guards, but as she observed the game, she began to understand its potential. The guards weren't just soldiers anymore. They were people, men with families, with hopes, with fears, just like the prisoners sitting across from them. Greta could see that, beneath the surface of hostility and distrust, there was a shared humanity that they were all struggling to deny. Her heart softened slightly as she watched one of the younger guards, a man named Corporal Mitchell, patiently explained the rules of the game to a group of prisoners who had never played before. The most surprising moment of the evening came when Lysel, the youngest of the prisoners, began to laugh. She had been struggling with the English names for the card combinations, but her attempt to say straight flush in her thick Bavarian accent made the entire table burst into laughter. It was a sound that had been absent from the camp for far too long. The laughter was genuine, not forced, and it bridged a gap that had seemed unbridgeable just days before. For the first time since their arrival, the prisoners and the guards shared a moment of pure joy, something that transcended the boundaries of nationality and captivity. The walls between them began to feel less solid, and for a brief moment, the camp no longer felt like a prison, but a place where people could, against all odds, connect. The next day, the mood in the camp was noticeably lighter. The prisoners, who had been withdrawn and wary just hours before, were now speaking more freely with the guards. There was an ease to their conversations, a sense of camaraderie that had been missing before. Even the older prisoners, who had been the most resistant to any kind of interaction with the Americans, were beginning to warm up to the idea. They saw how their younger comrades had found common ground with the soldiers, and they couldn't help but feel a sense of grudging respect for the effort the Americans were making. It wasn't enough to erase the pain of the war, but it was a step towards something more meaningful. For Greta, the shift was particularly significant. She had spent so much of her life teaching and guiding others, but here, in this foreign land, she had become a student again. She was learning what it meant to bridge the divide between captor and captive, to find humanity in places she never thought to look. The game had shown her that the guards, despite being the enemy, were still people, flawed, confused, and full of their own fears. She realized that just as she had been conditioned to hate the Americans, they too had been conditioned to hate her and her people. But in that small, unassuming moment of laughter over cards, something had shifted. It was a realization that would take time to fully understand, but it was a start. In the days that followed, the prisoners continued to participate in the card games, and even some of the more hardened guards began to take part. The games, simple as they were, became a regular part of the camp's routine, and they served as a reminder that, in the midst of war, there was still space for connection. The Americans were no longer just faceless enemies. They were human beings, with stories, with lives outside the camp, with families they worried about just as much as the prisoners worried about their own. And for the prisoners, this was a revelation. They had been taught that their enemies were heartless, but the reality was far more complex. The interactions between the guards and the prisoners didn't stop with card games. Over time, the lines between captor and captive continued to blur. The prisoners began to exchange small favors with the soldiers, offering a spare blanket here, sharing a story there. The guards, in turn, began to treat the prisoners with a level of respect they had not shown before. There was no sudden transformation, no dramatic change in the power dynamics of the camp, but there was a gradual shift towards something that felt, if not peaceful, then at least less hostile. It was a slow process, but it was progress nonetheless. By the end of the month, the camp had become a place where small acts of kindness were beginning to flourish. The card games were still a regular event, but now they were accompanied by conversations that delved deeper than surface-level exchanges. The prisoners and the guards talked about their homes, their hopes for the future, and the things that brought them comfort. It wasn't a perfect situation, and the wounds of war could not be easily forgotten. But the barrier between the two sides, once seemingly insurmountable, had begun to crack. It wasn't much, but it was a start, an unexpected but welcome start to a process of healing that no one had anticipated. As winter's chill crept across the camp, a heavy silence began to settle over the once bustling grounds of Camp Alona. The initial optimism that had followed the prisoners' arrival was gradually being replaced by a creeping sense of isolation. The days grew colder, and the once vibrant atmosphere of tentative camaraderie between the prisoners and their captors now seemed distant and fragile. There was a subtle shift, not in the way they treated each other, but in the way they felt about their surroundings. The cold, harsh realities of being a prisoner began to seep back into their daily lives. The once forgotten tension between them was now a quiet hum, barely audible, but ever present. The news came on a morning when the sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of snow. It arrived with the abruptness of a hammer striking an anvil, shattering the fragile peace that had begun to form. Liesl, the youngest prisoner, had collapsed during morning roll call. Her face was flushed, her breathing shallow, and the concern that spread across the faces of the other prisoners was immediate and unmistakable. They had grown accustomed to seeing one another in various states of fatigue, but this was different. Liesl's condition was serious. This was no mere illness. This was something more urgent. The camp doctor was called immediately, his professional demeanor masking the underlying urgency in his voice. After a quick examination, it was clear that Liesl had contracted a severe case of influenza. The doctor's voice carried the weight of experience as he ordered that she be moved to the infirmary and put under constant watch. The fever was high, and there was no telling how long it would take for her to recover. The news sent a ripple of unease through the camp. It wasn't just that Liesl was young or that she was ill. It was that something in the camp had shifted once again. The prisoners, once filled with defiance, now found themselves bound by a common, undeniable vulnerability. Sam Washington, the camp's cook, had seen his fair share of sick children and families in his time. He had grown up in a time when food was used to heal, to comfort, and to bring people together. His grandmother had always said that food was more than just sustenance. It was a way of showing love, of offering something that could heal wounds not just of the body, but of the soul. With Liesl in the infirmary, Sam felt a deep, personal need to help, to provide comfort in any way he could. He decided to make the one thing he knew would provide warmth and solace: cornbread. In the kitchen, Sam worked with a sense of urgency, moving through the motions with the familiarity of someone who had spent his life perfecting his craft. He prepared the cornbread with the same care and attention to detail that he had always given to his meals, but this time it felt different. This meal was not just for the prisoners, it was for Liesl, for someone who needed comfort, who needed warmth. Sam mixed the ingredients, carefully adding just the right amount of honey to sweeten it. He knew that the soft cornbread, soaked in warm milk, would be the kind of comfort that would reach beyond the walls of the infirmary and into the hearts of those who tasted it. When Sam arrived at the infirmary with the dish, his heart was heavy with the weight of what he was about to offer. Liesl was lying on a cot, her face pale with fever, her eyes barely open. The other prisoners, gathered around her, looked at Sam with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Sam had seen sickness before, but there was something in Liesl's condition that made him pause. She was so young, so full of life, and yet here she was, vulnerable to a sickness she had no control over. He had to do something, anything, to make her feel better. "Liesl," Sam said gently, sitting down beside her cot, "I brought you something that my grandmother used to make when we were sick. It's just cornbread soaked in warm milk with a little honey. It might help you feel better." He spooned a small portion of the cornbread into a bowl and held it out to her. At first, Liesl's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at the dish with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. She was too weak to speak, but her gaze seemed to convey a silent plea for comfort. With great effort, Liesl raised her head slightly, her hands trembling as she took the spoon from Sam's hand. She brought the cornbread to her lips and took a slow bite. The warmth of the milk and the sweetness of the honey seemed to melt the tension in her body, if only for a moment.
Sam watched her closely, his eyes filled with concern. He knew that food alone wouldn't cure her illness, but in that moment he hoped it would give her some relief, some sense of comfort in a world that had become increasingly uncertain.
As Lizel continued to eat, her body relaxed slightly, and for the first time since her collapse, there was a hint of color returning to her cheeks. Sam's heart swelled with a quiet sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The fever still raged in her, and there was no telling how long it would take for her to recover. The cornbread, simple as it was, had given her something that the medical care alone could not: a moment of warmth, a moment of humanity. Sam stayed by her side, watching as she finished the meal, his mind racing with thoughts of what else he could do to help. The other prisoners watched the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and awe. They had seen how food had the power to bridge gaps between them and their captors, but now they saw how it could also heal in the most fundamental way. They began to understand that the cornbread wasn't just a dish. It was a symbol of care, of hope, and of connection. It was a reminder that, despite the circumstances, there were still small acts of kindness that could make a difference. As Sam sat beside Lizel, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, he realized that this simple meal, this small act of kindness, was more powerful than any weapon, more enduring than any enemy. It was a gesture of humanity, and in that moment, it felt like the only thing that truly mattered.